Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another virtual event here at Madison Street Books in the West Loop in Chicago, Illinois. Tonight, we are thrilled to be able to welcome Héctor Tobar and Steve Sanderson in discussion of Héctor's latest book, his newest book, called The Last Great Road Bum. I've been teasing both Héctor and Steve this evening. I think that we are about to cover a lot of ground, both literally and figuratively. I want to take a moment and give you a little introduction. Many of you may be aware of Héctor and all of his amazing work as a writer. Probably, well, I shouldn't even say this, but one of his many significant works that stands out is Deep Down Dark, which was the story of the 33 Chilean miners that were trapped, as we all know. And Héctor brought that story to life for us in a way that I think was overwhelming for pretty much everybody. He is also a Pulitzer Prize, obviously, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and novelist. He has 2 nonfiction books, one of them being Deep Down Dark, and now 3 novels. Although I was saying to Steve earlier, would we really call this a novel, or are we changing the names to protect the not so innocent? And Steve suggests that it is really more a work of historic fiction. And to give a little introduction on Steve, the book is sort of the life and times of Joe Sanderson, who is Steve's younger brother. So Steve and Héctor worked together long and hard to bring us this really interesting and I don't know, delightful. I mean, it's delightful in a way. It's delightful to think there was a time when people traveled like this across the world and could encounter the people that Joe encountered and have the experiences that he had. I don't know that we can do that anymore, and certainly not with COVID, but it's also overwhelming and significant and really speaks to the time at which both Steve and Joe grew up. So I think we are in for a treat. I will turn you guys over to Héctor and Steve and check back with everyone in about an hour. Please feel free to put questions up on Facebook Live, and also please feel free to purchase this excellent book from, needless to say, madstreetbooks.com. But I think we really are in for a treat. So sit back and relax and let this unfold, because it's amazing.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the Mary, for that introduction, and thank you, Madison Street Books for having us. This book began with a man taking a journey out of Illinois, and when I was writing it, for the 10 years I spent working on it off and on, I always thought about Illinois and going there, and how the book would one day go back to Illinois and bring Joe's story back there. And today that's happening. Today we're seeing Joe Sanderson and his story return to Illinois, many years after he tried to write his own novels. And it's also a very special moment for me, because I'm here with Steve Sanderson, and Steve is Joe's brother, as Mary was telling us. And I have spent more than a decade now getting to know Steve and his family, and interviewing Milt Sanderson, also Steve's father, Steve and Joe's father, and getting to know Jenny, Steve's wife, and spending hours upon hours in their home trying to put the story together. And so the story, as I understood it when I began working on this, is that I was a reporter at the LA Times, and I'd heard about the diary of a man who had died fighting in the Civil War in El Salvador. And this diary had belonged to a North American man, a Norteamericano, a gringo, as they would say in El Salvador, who had given his life for the cause of the Salvadoran rebels. And he had died there as a result of injury sustained in battle in 1982. And this was more than 20 years later that I was being presented with his diary. And so that's what the book is about. The book is an attempt to reconstruct Joe Sanderson's amazing life, which is much more than just about his sacrifice and his adventures in El Salvador. It's also about a man in his relationship to his family. And so I think I want to start off by asking you, Steve, um, after Joe died in 1982, I know you were in the dark a lot about what had happened at the end of Joe's life, but how would you tell people how would you tell people about your younger brother when you wanted to discuss his life? What did you know about him? And what would you tell people about who your younger brother had been?
Thank you, Hector. And as you know, we did not know very much about what he was doing in El Salvador or how he had died. And
If you could step a little closer to the microphone too.
Okay, is that
Steve.
better?
Yeah, that's better. Yes.
And we heard about it through Jim Adams over CNN, and I called Atlanta, and we found out that that the report was apparently true. But we contacted the State Department, and there was no response from them because they were behind the government, not behind the rebels, and so they didn't know Joe existed. And so we were sort of in the dark, Hector. We really didn't know very much about it. And the only thing that we could do was just to explain to people that it was reported that he died. And everybody wondered, well, did you go to El Salvador? Did you get the money? Was there a funeral? And the answer, of course, was no. And we did not know anything about it until much later when you first contacted.
So what did you tell people about the life that he had led? What did you tell, what did you tell people about the kind of person he had been during his life?
We knew that he was a journalist. He was a writer. And he was going around following all these revolutions and writing and writing and writing. And we were not aware that he had taken up arms. And so we just thought it was an unfortunate event that happened to him later.
Right. And he had started off, though, very, very young. In the novel, I think it's 1962 or so, right, that he sort of heads off. He drops out of college. He goes first to the University of Florida, 1960, and then he goes to Hanover College in Indiana. Doesn't really do very well as a student. How did your mom and dad feel about him dropping out of school and hitting the road all those years?
Well, the mother was not happy about it at all. She was an accountant and was more or less of a traditional person. Her dad was a scientist, a professor, and I think he had a better understanding of the non-traditional way that Joe was going to do things.
Right. But were you astounded by just the number of countries that he visited? I ended up counting them at the end, and there was at least 70 countries. I wasn't very exact. I might have missed some. So I'm pretty sure it was at least 70. You keep on getting these letters from Joe. At first he goes to Jamaica, and then he goes to British Guiana, and then he keeps going. Then he goes all the way down to the tip of South America. What was your sort of like, take us back to 1961, 1962, 1963. What's going through your head as Joe goes farther and farther away from home?
It was always amazing how he went and how cheap he traveled and how he supported himself during all of these travels, by coming home occasionally and doing some rather high risk work or doing high risk work in South America. But no matter how far he went, we always thought he would be coming back soon.
Wow.
And he did come back frequently, but then he always left and went on the road again. And so, it was amazing how many countries he went to. We didn't realize at the very beginning that this was going to be a 20-year journey.
Right. I think I remember you telling me that your mother kept waiting for him to grow out of it, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
just kind of like, stop already with the sort of road bum routine and go back and finish your degree.
Yep.
Like every other Sanderson had done before him, right?
Yes. And this now, not knowing anything really concrete. We were contacted in 1997 by Consalvi, who was putting together the museum.
Let me
And
explain who that is.
okay,
Steve is talking about Carlos Consalvi, whose nom de guerre in the revolution was Santiago. And he had saved a lot of documentation related to the rebel radio station. And among that, he had saved Joe's diary. Joe was known as this guerrilla fighter. His nom de guerre was Lucas. Everyone knew him as Lucas in the rebel army. And so he contacted you, Steve, then you said 1996, 1997?
yeah.
And that would have been 5 years after the war was over. Yes.
He was requesting materials for the museum, but I do not have any knowledge or any memory that we ever furnished him any materials. And then in 2007, I received an email. We had just moved from Illinois to South Carolina. And on November 6, 2007, I received a 3-line email, which I'm going to read to you.
Okay.
I'm Héctor Tobar, the Mexico City bureau chief of the LA Times, and I have been reading your brother Joe's diary. The people at the FMLN Museum in San Salvador Xeroxed a copy for us and gave us this email for you. Does this email work? Héctor. And I still have a copy of that, and that's what started the whole adventure.
That was the beginning of our friendship. Our friendship
Yes.
began with those 3 lines. And, I didn't know several things about it. And, which in hindsight, well, number one, I didn't know that the rebels had never told you exactly how Joe died. And I can imagine, as someone who has lost loved ones and often been in a situation of interviewing people who've lost loved ones, how difficult that was for you to spend at that point, 2008, 7, that would have been already 25 years, almost 25 years, a quarter century, without knowing how your brother had died. And, and the rebels, even when they contacted you, it wasn't to tell you, hey, your brother was one of our companions and he died, and we want to sort of share with you what happened. And it just, and for the rebels, I have to, just sort of explain for them, they lost thousands of people. And so I think that for them, it would have been, they would have had, thousands of conversations like that. And so that might have led them to be, and also they didn't think about it. They didn't think about what you didn't know. And so for me, that's part of how our relationship began was me telling you what had happened to him. And were you at all surprised by some of the things that I told you, Steve?
Well, yes, and I think the most compelling thing about everything was after you went to El Salvador and you actually talked to Santiago and the people down there. And even though you were not able to visit the gravesite, you came back, and by telephone you said that you had been there, and that was the first time I fully accepted the fact that Joe was dead, because up until then, I always figured every time someone knocked on the door, every time the phone rang, it could have been Joe. That was the very first time that I knew for certain he had been killed.
Yes, because, just to recap, you were referring earlier to the CNN sort of story that had come out. That's how you found out that Joe had died. That CNN story was from a United Press International wire story, which itself was from someone in San Salvador listening to Rebel Radio and mishearing Joe's name. So Joe comes out as Joe S. Anderson, right? Or Joe A. Anderson. And so you had and that's all you knew, was that he had died. They mentioned the name of a town. And what I learned when I went to El Salvador was, I interviewed Santiago, who was with Joe when Joe was wounded. Also in Mexico City, I interviewed the rebel doctor who had been a northern Mexican doctor who had volunteered to join the rebels and be one of their doctors. He was actually treated Joe. And so I was able to give you all these details and a little bit of closure after all those years.
Yeah. And that was, the first time I really accepted it, because all the rest of it had just been hearsay.
Right. All it had been hearsay.
You know.
And and I read in the novel, I tried to, your mom died in 1986. That's correct, right? 1986. And so I tried to imagine her in this state of mourning that's also, indefinite, and how hard that must have been for her, to not really know for certain what had happened to him. I can only imagine as a parent.
Yes, yes. And she died without ever having closure.
Wow.
Yeah. And Hector, I think it was always her dream that, he would come back, get married, get a job, settle down, buy a house, raise a family, and do all the traditional things. And it did not happen in her lifetime, and it did not happen in his lifetime.
Wow.
And I think she really never forgave herself
Wow.
for not somehow fixing something that would make him end up living a more traditional.
Well, all parents are that way. It's not entirely rational. She's confronted with he was already in his 30s. Joe died at the age of 39. He was a person with copious amounts of free will. And, no one really could tell him what to do. No one could tell him to do anything. But one of the things that struck me, I never met your mother, but the first thing I learned about her, my first impression of your mother, is when I was in South Carolina, and you showed me the boxes of letters and the way that she had cataloged the letters from 20 years of Joe's travels from, I think, 4 or 5 continents, the letters he wrote from Africa, the letters he wrote from South America, the letters from Jamaica, the final letters from El Salvador, all lovingly cataloged. There were index cards that she had typed up the list, an order of the letters. She had numbered each envelope. They were all in perfect order. I just really felt an act of love in that. And can you tell me a little bit more about your mother and why she may have saved these letters in this way?
Well, number one, that's kind of the way she was. And as you later found out, that's kind of the way I am, because I saved all of Joe's letters that had come to me and to her father and from others, plus all of his papers and all that. So I guess my mom and I were really savers. And as you saw when you read the letters that he wrote to her were very upbeat and very cheerful.
Wow.
He wrote somewhat different letters to me, and somewhat even yet different letters to her dad.
Right.
Joe was a pilot. I was a pilot. We would talk about aviation things. He would talk to Dad about philosophical things. But
Right.
as you saw from the letters to my mom, they were all pretty upbeat and pretty cheerful and pretty descriptive. I mean, he took you on a trip with his words. And I think she just thought that was a journey worth saving.
Oh my God. That would have been a great title for the book. A Journey Worth Saving. That's almost going to bring tears to my eyes to think about that. Absolutely. And I think I imagined her when I created her on the page. I imagined her, and also from what you told me about her, and also I had access to many letters that she wrote back to Joe. Towards the end of her life, when he was in El Salvador, she was keeping carbon copies, probably, right? Carbon copies of the letters. And I imagined her as being someone who's very reserved, very Midwestern, right? Very Midwestern in terms of not really showing emotion, but who I think really in the end was kind of proud of Joe at his boldness and how, and how just he stuck to his vision of what he wanted to do with his life.
That is correct. And as you remember, she and my stepfather lived in a retirement village.
Right.
And the people there were all senior citizens. And so when the ladies got together, they bragged about their children and grandchildren. And my mom had a grandchild to brag about, my daughter, but she was also in the unique position that she could brag about Joe's travels, and she could tell the rest of the senior citizens their tales from Argentina that they just couldn't not even imagine. And so
Right.
she took some delight, along with a lot of fear, in his travels.
Yeah, and I described something that you told me once, and it was from one of our first interviews because I interviewed you so many times. But one of the first times you told me how when a letter arrived from Joe at one point, your mom would call you over because you lived on the other side of Champaign-Urbana, say, "Come on over. We got a letter from Joe," and you guys would have a meal, a dinner, supper, and then someone, and then she would read the letter out loud. And sometimes your mother was there. I mean, excuse me, your grandmother was there, and your mom would just would skip the cuss parts. She would skip the cuss
Yeah.
words.
And the other thing, Hector, there was also good food always involved.
Right.
When we went over there. And the other thing, she did not open the letter until after we had eaten and were sitting around, and then she opened and read the letter. So she had not read the letter before we got there. It was an event. I
Wow.
mean, it was a real event.
You see, now that's something I didn't know. If I had known that, I would have put that in the novel. But now, yeah, that's now I have that regret. That's like my first regret of something I don't know. Now the other thing that I did when I was working on this novel, at your insistence, you always insisted, Steve, that I talk to your dad, Milt, especially since he was getting on in years. And I flew out to Pennsylvania, and I spent a good portion of a week talking with him. And so with Milt, Milt was so, I really sensed a deep pride in Joe. And also, I really sensed a sense of hurt. He felt, I think like your mom, like you had talked about your mom, that he had failed to protect Joe. A lot of his, he was much older, obviously, and he was a little bit irascible, and he was relitigating his relationship with your mother and everything, right? But what I got from him, and what's I think in the first part of the novel, is this stuff of Joe's boyhood, because Milt had really vivid memories of you and your brother as children, and Joe as this very curious, but also somewhat vulnerable young man. And so that to me was just really that. And you mentioned also Jim Adams. Jim Adams, who Steve mentioned at the beginning, was one of Joe's best friends in Champaign-Urbana growing up in high school. And so Jim Adams also gave me this portrait of your childhoods, and what they look like. And I just wanted to say what joy it was to sort of try to recreate 1950s Urbana, and also to get to that emotional truth that your father wanted to share with me, which is that this was a special boy. I believed he was special.
That's a good observation, and I think my mom's reaction always was, what could I have done to prevent this? And I think my dad's reaction with equal sadness was, Joe was doing what he really wanted to do. He was living the life he wanted to live, where I think my mom thought Joe was still living a temporary life and would eventually come back, come home. And I think my dad knew that Joe was always going to live this life.
Wow.
And that he died doing what he wanted to do.
Now, I know you have questions that you want to throw to me, so I'm going to ask you one last question, which is a big one, which is, what was it like for you to see me write this book? And, because I sent you the completed manuscript, and I told you what I was finding. What was it like to and then you read the early version that I turned into my agent and my editor. You read the final version. What was it like for you to watch me write this book about your family?
That's very interesting. And I think you need to tell the audience about the documents and information stash that you discovered when you came first to visit us in South Carolina. But what this was like to me, as you became more and more and more immersed in this over the period of time, and I'm going to give you a hint. One of the questions that someone told me to ask you is, why did it take you 11 years to write this book? But as you came to our house and worked with us, literally. We gave you our house, we gave you access to everything. During the period of time, you not only became a part of our family, but in a lot of ways, you became Joe. You had to become Joe
Right.
to be able to put yourself in his mindset, to take the facts that you read in his letter and yet be able to fill it in during the gaps between letters and between countries and between girlfriends and between everything else. You had to become Joe. And I don't know how many times you came to South Carolina. I know you've been here to visit us in Florida. And I would like for you to explain the amount of documents that we provided to you, but you really became part of our family, and you are Joe. You have replaced Joe in our family.
Yeah, I guess he was, part of him was resurrected in me when I decided to become a writer myself, which actually was about the time that Joe died. You know, by the time that Joe died, I was in college, and I was really learning that I love to write, and maybe something passed between us. And so, yes, this process for me was coming to your house in South Carolina the first time, and you showing me these boxes of letters, and me realizing, oh my God, before this guy got to El Salvador, he spent 20 years circling the world. And I just remember too, the stamps on the letters were so beautiful. That in itself, the stamps were like this journey, the stamps from Zambia, the stamps from Kuwait, the stamps from Nepal, and the letters, of course, from all these destinations. And then I discovered, you know, to my great surprise, that this guy, Joe, had also been trying to write novels, and that you had all of his novel manuscripts. So really, after those first couple of meetings, after I wrote my first story for the LA Times, which came out in 2008, I just spent all these years going through the material almost chronologically. You know, I had you send me a sampling of different letters. I had a sense of how big this story was. And I told myself, I'm going to go through this, you know, in order, chronologically, from the very first letters, which are from 1960, which, you know, he wrote when he went off to the University of Florida, which your companion, your spouse, Jenny Bloom, uses in her own studies of what it's like to be a young undergraduate, all the way up to his first and second journeys around the world, in which he became sort of addicted to this idea of action. And so I was, you know, I didn't want to make you, because I knew it would be torture. I didn't want to make you, and after a while I knew you would probably do it. I didn't want to make you copy all those letters. That would have been, you know, I didn't want to make you do that. So I just kept going back and working my way through the archive, you know, through the Sanderson archive. And I always remember I had like 3 or 4 days that I would visit you, maybe 3, maybe 4. And I would be just always in a rush, you know, because there was so much. And I felt like I was just sort of like, you know, I was just sort of touching my toes into the water. It was just such a big pool of information. So that's why it took, that's why it took 11 years. And the other part that took 11 years is because I decided that since Joe was trying to write a novel, I should make this a novel. And part of it is about writing. And part of it is getting to know you and getting to know your mom, getting to know Milt, getting to know Champaign-Urbana, getting to know Illinois. And I'm a Guatemalan dude from, you know, from LA. And so for me, I mean, Champaign-Urbana was, you know, the most exotic place I'd ever been to. It was like, oh my God, I remember you telling you and other relatives in the Sanderson family, oh my God, this place is so magical. You know, it's like these stone buildings, and it's, you know, and there's this river that goes through it, and it's all surrounded by corn. Wow. And so yeah, that's why it took me that long. Yeah.
I have to share with our audience, the last time Hector came to Florida, we set him up in my office with a table and access to all of the material. And I had brought in a copy machine, put on the edge of the table, and I said, here, this is what, if you want to make copies. And Hector said, no, that's okay. I'll just take pictures with my camera. And when he left, he had used the entire ream of paper to make copies.
I did, yes. I have, I feel like I've made a backup copy of your collection of the letters, which is very important. And I think it's very important that Joe's, the product of his labor be preserved. But yeah, it was an amazing story. And so do you have another question there?
No, I've done my same question. Why did it take 11 years? Were there some interruptions during the 11-year
Oh,
process?
well, yes. I mean, what had happened was I first started writing this as a nonfiction book proposal in 2008, 2009. And it never really sort of jumped off the page for me. At the same time, I was finishing a novel. And my nonfiction book proposals about Joe, he felt kind of sad. Now, you've read stories about him. The story that was in Mother Jones, for example, that came out maybe a year or so after his death. And Joe doesn't really, it's not really Joe. I mean, it's some of the details of what he did, but it doesn't quite as crazy and as full of life as he is. And so I felt that with my nonfiction proposals was that it wasn't really going anywhere. So I finished my novel, The Barbarian Nurseries, and then I was about to start again on the book and on writing about Joe. And then I got a call from my agent about writing the Chilean Miners book. And I'm really glad I did those two things because I got more experience writing novels. This is now my third novel, my novel about Joe, our novel about Joe. And now I had that huge project of writing about the Chilean miners, which was a huge research project. And those things prepared me. Everything I did up to that moment was a kind of training to write, the Sanderson family story in my novel.
Okay, now could I ask you another question?
Yes.
Okay. If Joe was alive today, what do you think he would be doing, and what do you think he would think of the book?
Well, I think that Joe would have come back from El Salvador, which he wanted to do. He didn't want to die. He didn't want to be a martyr in any way. He was as I discovered when I was reading his diary, the diary he was carrying on his back when he died, and which was saved by Santiago Carlos Consalvi. Joe had been bugging the rebel commanders to go home. He's like, hey, I'm old. I'm too old for this. I think I could really serve the revolution in the States, which, I'm sure he could have. And if they had let him go, and I think the reason they kept him too was because he was so valuable. He was an English speaker. He was a terrific shot, those stories that are in the novel about Joe being an excellent, marksman are true stories that were told to me by rebels in El Salvador. So he was valuable to them in so many ways. And so they didn't, so they kept him. But if he had gone home, he would have gone on a tour of the United States and given talks about his experience with the rebels. He would have been followed by the CIA, by the FBI. They would have been all over your house, Steve. And you would have noticed all these sort of unmarked cars circling your house there in Illinois where you lived then. And then they would have forgotten about him and he would have attempted to write his book, and maybe it would have turned out the way all of his others attempts to write books were, that he didn't really seek out any help for the writing, right? He didn't really try to get help with the writing, and maybe people would have forgotten about El Salvador. I think he had a pretty good chance of actually finishing a book and completing it. I mean, and publishing it. And I think that, let's say he didn't write the book and I came around and wrote this book for him. I think he would have been telling me, much like in the book, where Joe is speaking from the afterlife in the footnotes. No, you got that wrong. No, that's not the way it was. Or, why are you concentrating on this? And, I think he would have been really happy to have his story finally come to light. It's to me one more part of the American experience. You read lots of books from people who went through these amazing experiences in the 1960s and 1970s, and then tell their story many years later when they can reflect. And I think he would have been, and I think if he's looking down now, I think he'd be very happy to have his story out in print, and especially since I gave him a lot of room to speak. I mean, there's like tons, all the quotes in the novel from Joe's letters are verbatim quotes from his novel. The letter, the what he wrote in his journal, those are all verbatim quotes. So that's the real Joe Sanderson, me just cleaning up a little bit of his grammar and doing a lot of editing, tightening up, but it's all Joe's words. And I think that's part of the power of the work, I hope.
This may be premature, but is there any interest in the book from Hollywood?
I haven't heard yet, but I've got a call scheduled. My agent has scheduled me for a call soon, so I'll find out and I'll ask him. But I've always thought that it would make a wonderful film, although now maybe more of a television series. Who knows? But no, I haven't got. I did have some interest a long time ago, but I sort of put it aside because we were working on the novel, on the book. So better to finish the book and then see what happens.
One more question for you. During this process, did you ever get a chance to meet any of Joe's many girlfriends?
Yes, and I met one of Joe's girlfriends and met with her many times, thanks to you, Steve, because she had kept in touch with you. I think she was looking for ways to remember him. She's in the book. She only wants to be known by the name of Mafalda. But she had reached out to you, and then when I came around, you put her in touch with me, right? And I met with her at least three times here in Southern California because she has family out here, and we kept in touch. And I spoke with her at length about her relationship with Joe, and she also was able to share letters that he wrote to her. And as you say, his letters, to different people were, they had different tone, and so he wrote love letters to her. And also, you could sort of tell that he was kind of clueless about their relationship in some ways, which I tried to reflect in the novel. And it was a different time. Men and women had different kinds of relationships, especially American men and women had different kinds of relationships. She's Portuguese. And she told me this incredible story that I never would have been able to make up on my own about meeting Joe on a cruise ship. Because back then this is in the mid 1960s, people traveled on cruise ships more than they did, and you didn't have to be rich. They were just regular sort of passenger ships between these major cities. And so Joe traveled from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to England. And on the way, there was a stop in Lisbon, and he meets her in Lisbon. And this is all detailed in the novel. He and I never would have been able to make this up. He already has another girlfriend, a British woman that he's met on the first leg of the trip. And even though they're all in the ship, he breaks up with the first girlfriend and seduces and romances Mafalda, who is still, just feels so deeply close to him after all these years. And she was another person who told me her story of finding out how Joe had died. She was in a college town in the Midwest where she was working, and she saw the Mother Jones story with Joe's picture in this hammock, which is reproduced in the novel, a picture by Susan Meiselas, who is working for the New York Times as a freelancer. Her picture appears later in Mother Jones, and it's of Joe in this hammock. And she realizes at that moment, looking at the story, that Joe has died. And so she wasn't aware. She had just stopped receiving letters from him. Right. So yes, I did interview at least one of his girlfriends, and I've heard from a couple since then who have written to me, at least two others actually, who live in different parts of the United States. And my book, I'm hopeful that the book is successful enough that I hear from more.
There are several people from Joe's past who are on this call tonight.
Okay.
And I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but our audience is pretty wide ranging. We have people on this call from Tasmania and New Zealand.
Oh my gosh.
So, and while I've got the floor here, I've got one question that has come in that I can answer. Someone has said, Steve, is that in your MG in front of your home in Urbana? And the answer is yes. What is Joe waving his hat? What was the event? Joe and I delivered newspapers in the MG, and that photo was staged by the newspaper we both worked for a feature article they ran. And what Joe is waving over his head, I'm 16 years old, and he's either 13 or 14. And he's got a newspaper that he's getting ready to heave into the front yard. And that is taken on Mumford Drive in Urbana. And if Julie Strang Hunt is on this call, that is your house in the background, Julie.
Wow.
And someone has put a question. Héctor how exactly did you find Joe?
Yeah, how did did I find out about Joe? That's a really good question. And I was the LA Times bureau chief in Mexico City. So that meant I covered Mexico and Central America. Now, one of the secrets of being a foreign correspondent is that we have a lot of help. So I had researchers in Mexico City, two in Mexico City, and I also had a researcher in San Salvador, whose job it was to cover Central America, to help me cover Central America. And his name is Alex Renderos. He's mentioned in the acknowledgments of the book. And Alex would call me every day and just pitch story ideas and tell me what was happening. And Alex was is the consummate networker. He knows everybody in San Salvador, knows people on the left, on the right, in the government, in movements and everything. So he called me one day and he just told me, hey, I heard this story that over at the Museum of the Revolution and Museo de la Palabra y la Imagen in San Salvador, they have this diary. Santiago was telling me about it. He wants to find out more about it. Would you be interested in seeing this diary? It's by this North American guy. And so I started reading this diary. He faxed me a few pages over to Mexico City. And then I asked him for more and he FedExed me some pages to Mexico City. And I was looking at this and I thought, oh my God, this is an American blonde Che Guevara, you know? I'd also by that time found a couple of pictures of him. And, you know, these pictures were from Joe in his late 30s, kind of rugged looking, you know, flowing blonde hair, you know, kind of tough. You know, by that time, he already looked like a lot of the guys in El Salvador thought he was a Vietnam vet because he had kind of that rugged look, you know, that you sort of see in movies of Vietnam vets after the war. He wasn't a Vietnam vet. He had gone to Vietnam as a tourist. And he was also a former Army medic, but he wasn't an Army soldier or veteran of the Vietnam War. So they had all these stories about him. And that's how I first found out about Joe Sanderson. And that's when I took some letters from that diary and faxed them over to Steve.
Okay. Hector, do you have any questions for me now?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of to ask you how your mom and dad felt about having this rebel movement, this Marxist rebel movement, having their name associated with Joe. Did it make them, did you make your mom especially uncomfortable? How do you think she sort of dealt with the fact that he was, because your mom was a very, very, very dedicated Republican, member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, active. You know, I remember seeing in one of her letters, or you told me about how she had been involved in sending letters to Jimmy Carter about taxes and everything. How do you think she dealt with that part of Joe's story, of the fact that he had been associated with this band of Marxist rebels?
You know, I don't think she really thought about that. I think she read into his letters what she wanted to read. And I did the same thing. I got letters from him, and our dad got letters from him that were a little bit more descriptive of what he was doing. But I really think at that time we read and believed what we wanted to believe. And I always I mean, he had been all over the world covering all sorts of revolutions. You know, he was in Vietnam, he was in Nigeria during the war down there, but always as a writer, always as a tourist. And I think we just didn't want to think that he had gotten wrapped up in that. And I don't believe we really realized the full extent of what he was doing.
Right.
Until you were able to come and reread his letters and sort of read between the lines
right.
what was really happening. So I don't think she wanted to think about it.
Yeah, and I have to say also, just in the interest of 100% honesty and truth, is that as someone who's read Joe's diary, every single page of it, and all the letters he wrote home, and his diary was for himself personally, he was not a Marxist. He was not a communist. I mean, not that that's a bad thing, but you know, he was someone who really sort of had this sort of notion of himself as someone who was aiding a just cause. These people are being massacred by this right-wing government. He had heard so many stories of rape and murder and, torture and mass murder. He had seen the effects of a massacre, which is detailed in the novel, the famous El Mozote massacre. So I think he always maintained this sort of sense of idealism. And he actually was kind of frustrated with the hierarchy of the rebel movement. He was frustrated, but he understood that they needed to be an army. So it was a very complicated thing. And so I just thought I would interject that. Now, Steve, I see here that we have here passed on to us a question for you, actually, which was that if any of your children or your grandchildren were ever inspired by Joe to go out and lead the life of a road bum in a modern day, how would you respond to that?
Well, that's very interesting, Hector. You've not met, you've talked to my daughter, Kathy.
Right.
You've talked to her. We have 3 grandchildren. One of them is going to become a research scientist, and I don't think she's going to hit the road. The next one is probably going to be a doctor or a musician or something like that. Our grandson, there's no telling what he's going to do. He's very much his own man. And I guess I would say if he wanted to hit the road, I would say, Ryan, that's your life. You have to live it. Go for it.
Wow.
Now, interestingly enough, we have a cousin who she's a cousin on my dad's side of the family who has been on the road almost all of her adult life and has just now started a new position with the State Department in China. But prior to that, she's married and her husband went with her, but she was on the road working in South America and New Zealand, in China, in Korea, and all that. So we do have a little bit of that blood in the family. So I guess I would encourage a grandchild, well, go ahead and try it.
Wow. Well, that's a really great grandfather answer too, because grandfathers, I think grandparents get a little bit more tolerant with age, towards the craziness of your, of your progeny,
And I'm sure I'll hear from my daughter tomorrow.
Now, one thing I wanted to ask you, is in reference to the previous question I asked you, was when you picked up the novel and you saw, almost day by day descriptions of Joe's life in the rebel army, was there anything that shocked you or anything that you really were totally surprised by, where there's lots of things? What was your sort of feeling reading those passages where I reconstructed what Joe's life was like and the things that he did in this guerrilla army?
It was very surprising when I read it in the book, but remember during your research, you and I had talked a lot about some of this stuff. So it hit me rather gently rather than abruptly, but it opened my eyes to a whole new side of Joe that I didn't know anything about. So, but again, I think when I was reading his letters when he was in El Salvador, I was reading what I wanted to read.
Right.
So I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Well, yes, but I'm sort of just specifically thinking about some after this massacre takes place, because actually the diary that I had, because Joe had kept other diaries and they had been lost. They were lost in the rebel encampment when the army came in and invaded, and they had hidden a whole bunch of stuff. And it might have some of his diaries might have been burned. And Joe describes this in the final diary, the final 300 pages, which is what I had. He describes part of it being burned. But so in that section, Joe has already seen the aftermath of a massacre. I mean, he's seen where government troops killed several hundred people. And so he's enraged, he's angered. And there are several battle scenes where Joe is describing what he does in the battle, right? He's someone who's been trained by the US Army, right? And how to use the M1 and the M16. And he uses it for what it was meant to be used. And I always just sort of, I was always afraid that I would just shock you or cause you to say, no, this couldn't have happened. Or I just was always wondered what your reaction was to those battle scenes.
And it did not shock me because, like myself, he had also been in the army. He was trained to do that. But you also mentioned that he was trained as a medic, so
Right.
I think he would have put equal effort into shooting a gun as well as he would bandaging a wounded person, because that was his training. That was what he was trained to do. And I think, uh, he would have done that equally. So it did not shock me that he picked up a gun any more than it shocked me that he would have treated the wound.
Wow. That's an amazing answer. And
Yeah.
yeah, that
And
was, mhm.
and just to recap his army experience, he was in the Illinois National Guard, which is only 6 months active duty.
Oh,
He was trained as a medic, and after his training, he worked at Fort Leonard Wood as a medic at a roadside dispensary. Then, when he got out, he was remanded to the Illinois National Guard and was supposed to go to weekly guard meetings for 5.5 years. But instead, he went to British Guiana and was working on a diamond dredge. And so within a year, the Army deemed him as an incompatible occupation, and he was discharged and released from the National. So his service was really 6 months active duty, where he received all of this marksmanship and medical training. And he received the highest marksmanship medal that they grant.
right. He was expert marksman,
Yeah.
and which is not surprising because, you guys grew up shooting. You guys knew how to shoot as kids. And one of the things that Steve showed me was the rifle that Winchester rifle, I believe, yes, that your father had purchased for Joe, and which Joe kept for his entire life. Obviously, he left it behind when he went on his travels. So Joe was handy with a firearm. And then later, from his girlfriend Mafalda, I found out he was carrying, either I think it was a 22 or a 38 on his trip around the world. Back then, you could go anywhere, and it was easier to carry a gun around. But she was still very, very surprised to find out that he was carrying this gun. So Joe was handy with firearms. Now we have a question here from Mary, who's I think passing on a question from the audience, which is, Hector, in your opinion, could an American live a similar life to Joe Sanderson today? And I think the answer to that is absolutely not. Absolutely not. Could someone live a life like Joe Sanderson? And that's why I called it the last great road bum, because Joe lived a time that has passed. I mean, first of all, Americans back then, we were heroes everywhere we went. And there was a certain glamour attached to being an American abroad. And also just many of the routes he traveled have just become too dangerous. He hitchhiked through Damascus, through Syria. He hitchhiked through Iran, and he hitchhiked through Afghanistan. And obviously no one can do that today. And so I think that it's very difficult to live that kind of life, carefree life. People are much more cautious on the road than they used to be. I think it would be very, very difficult for someone to have that kind of life today. Don't you agree, Steve?
Yeah, yeah. And that's really a great question. Yeah, that's really nice. I may have one more here for you.
Okay.
I may have run out of questions for you, so I guess you get tell us about your trip to Urbana when you got to meet Jim Adams and he showed you the high school and the houses that we lived in and all that. And really, that was kind of your first taste of the cornfields of the Midwest.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think it was, it was a risky thing for the novel to begin in Champaign-Urbana, to begin in the 1950s. But I wanted to sort of begin with the beginning of the story, and um, Joe's the beginning of his wanderlust. And Jim Adams and Milt and you told me all these wonderful stories that I was able to patch together into those first chapters. Among them, I believe it was Jim who told me about Joe paddling a canoe down the Sangamon River when he was still an adolescent. That he just upped and got left from Champaign-Urbana, found the nearest roadside where he could carry a canoe into the Sangamon, and made it all the way, like 40 or 50 miles, halfway to Decatur, I think he made it. And so that to me was essential, just understanding who he was. And then Jim told me this wonderful story that's also in the novel about the night that he and Joe broke into, I believe it was the Champaign City or Champaign County traffic department, and stole all this yellow traffic paint. And they made some stencils of the Playboy bunny logo as teenagers. And they covered the entire city, the entire metropolis of Champaign-Urbana with these logos, including even the sort of pioneer cabin that's in the middle of the university. There used to be a water tower, which is no longer there, in the center of Urbana. They climbed up to the water tower, or Joe climbed up to the water tower, and he painted a logo at the top of the water tower. And so to me, that was a wonderful experience, just because, to me, it was also foreign, as someone who grew up in a barrio town in Los Angeles, a barrio, Latino barrio, very urban, very big city. This sort of college town childhood as townies, because Joe and Jim, and you, Steve, you were all townies. You were all the local guys. The University of Town people come in, they spend their 4 years, they go away, or the professors, they get another job and they leave, and many of them do. And so you're this sort of towny life. And then it was also and learning about Joe's first sort of romantic encounters with the late Karen Thomas too, and being able to fictionalize that and try to imagine it and make it come to life. I think it really contributed a lot to the novel, because otherwise it's just a novel about a crazy American guy who goes off to El Salvador and dies, which is what the stories about him said after he died. And it's not the story of a guy who loves his family, because to me, that was the central message I got from reading all of these letters, was how much Joe loved you guys. He always wanted to come home. He always wanted to tell stories, the stories of the things that had happened to him. But it was almost as if he did those things not to write a novel, as he was telling himself, oh, I'm doing all these things because I'm going to write the great American novel, which he never managed to do. But what he did manage to do was to come home and tell you stories from his trips. And so to be able to sort of understand that home and paint a picture of that home, and to understand, that in your family too, there's this story that goes back beyond Champaign-Urbana. It goes back to Kansas. It goes back to Oklahoma and the Great Depression. All of that was very, very important to me. And all of that was born in that first trip to Champaign-Urbana.
I always wondered if Joe had written his novels as well as he wrote his letters back home, if it might have been a little bit different, because his letters home were excellent. I mean, they took you on a trip. You could see things through his eyes. But when I tried to read some of his writings, as did a couple of editors that I showed them to, they were unreadable.
Right.
They were just unreadable.
Yeah, he what happened was that with Joe's novels, he was trying to sound like the writers he admired. He was trying to sound like Hemingway. He was trying to sound like James Jones. He was trying to sound like Lawrence. He was trying to sound like these great novelists. And then later, like Hunter S. Thompson, the one novel that he did hire someone to revise, his novel about, and, you know, folks, we've crammed a lot into this, but believe it or not, Joe actually was involved with, you know, Bolivia and the certain white powder. we know that he was involved in that. And he wrote a novel called The Cocaine Capers. And he was trying to imitate Hunter S. Thompson instead of, like, you know, just being the guy writing letters home to his mom, which of course, he was always honest. I was so surprised, and I still am, how honest he was with your mom. I mean, he's telling her when he was 22, hey mom, I'm in a camp in Jamaica smoking marijuana with the Rastafarians. You know, a lot of boys would try to hide that from their moms. Right, Steve?
That brings up another question here. Thinking back now, Hector, through all of this, what is your favorite memory
My favorite memory?
of Joe, or the stuff you read, or the process you went through in researching and writing the book? Do you have a favorite memory, an incident that stands out above all others?
Well, I wouldn't call it a favorite memory, but it's definitely the most powerful memory. I have two. And the first one is that phone call when I told you all that I knew and all I had pieced together about how Joe had died. Because at that moment, I gave you closure, and I thought to myself, look, if I don't even ever write anything more about this guy, I at least did something useful, something human, which is that I gave this family closure, right? Which they didn't have. And that in itself, independent of whatever happened with my news story that I wrote for the LA Times, independent of the fact if I ever wrote a book, that in itself would justify my work on this, would just be doing that for an Illinois family, for an American family, and the family of a man who gave his life for the people of my region of the world, Central America, right? He gave his life for the Salvadoran people. And so that to me was a really a moment I'll always treasure about this project. And as to a favorite moment is this time when, you know, I went down to South Carolina where you had then moved to. Oh, and actually, no, it was in Florida that this happened. You were in Florida, you had just moved to Florida. And I was already deep into writing this novel. And I read to you a passage of the novel from the moment in which Joe goes off to college. And I read this passage to you because I wanted you to get a sense of what I was doing, you know, and I was also very proud of what I had just written. And it's Joe it's based on these photographs that you had shown me that are in your massive archive of Joe's life, of the day he went off to college. He's at the Champaign train station, the Amtrak station, or the train, you know, passenger train station, waiting to go for the train to take him on his first leg of his journey to Gainesville, Florida, to the University of Florida. And so I wrote this passage in which I describe that waiting on the train platform. And I describe it from your mom's point of view, from Virginia Sanderson's point of view. I describe it from his girlfriend, Karen Thomas's point of view. And I describe it from Joe's point of view. And when I had finished writing that, finished reading that to you and Jenny, I looked up and you had tears in your eyes and you said, oh my God, you're bringing them all back to life. And I still get emotional at that, because that's like, you know, part of what we try to do as writers is to give testimony to a real story and to real people who deserve to be remembered. And so to me, that was probably my favorite moment of the entire process.
And I think our listeners can now see what I mean when you say you have become part of the family.
Well, thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that. And I think we've now reached the end of our hour, and I see Mary here popping up.
Yes. Mary, do you have any questions for us now? Did we answer all of your questions?
You did. You got most all of them. I'm pretty pleased. I have a few more, but I have a few more pages in the book to cover. So I think in the end, I'll get the full picture. But I feel like now I have great backstory. And just a little aside, I recently spent a little bit of time in Urbana. My son was a student at University of Illinois, and he just graduated, and he was down there for the summer, and he lost our cat. So I spent 4 days traversing Urbana trying to find the cat. So when I'm looking at your picture and listening to you talk about Urbana and talk about, you know, University of Illinois and the, you know, true Midwest and the cornfields, and it rings very true. So when I had it in the book, that was one thing. And then hearing you guys talk about it and thinking about what your childhood would have been like there at that time versus what it is now, it must have been spectacular. So I have a few more questions that I'm going to answer, but I haven't quite finished the book yet. So I have a feeling that, you know, and I do have your email addresses, gentlemen. So if I need something.
And we should also say here, and we're about to wrap this up, that look, if you have enjoyed our conversation, people out there in the, you know, in the cyber sphere, please buy the book from Madison Street Books. Go to the link, go to the bookstore, order it from them, support your independent bookstore, because independent bookstores keep writers like me going, writers of literary fiction, and they keep writers telling stories like those of Joe Sanderson, stories that are, and she's, Mary, can you say something so so that we can see the image there?
Can you guys see?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So this is the book. We have many copies. We're really excited about it. It's right on our front table in the new releases section. And the other thing that's really kind of great about this book, it's really tactile. I don't know if anybody has a copy at home, but if you don't, you've got to get in here and feel it, because all this blue is actually raised on the cover. And it's just, I love the cover. It's a fantastic piece of artwork, I think. And Steve, I hope that your family is pleased, because it's really beautifully positioned, with your brother right there in the center in all of his youth and vigor, I'm sure. And I love it. It's a fabulous cover.
And if you open it up, there is inside the front cover, there's a map of Joe's travels. An
incredible map.
Yes.
He really did just go everywhere. It's unbelievable. And then we get a couple of really great photos too. So we really, I mean, it's an amazing book, and it's an amazing story. I mean, it really is unbelievable. And so it's so reflective of a time. So anyway, thank you very much, Hector, for doing my job for me, madstreetbooks.com. And many thanks to Hector and Steve, because it's people like them that make it really fun and interesting to be a bookstore. So. Good night, gentlemen.
Thank you for having us. Thank you so much. It's been an honor. And thank you, Steve, for joining us too, and everybody.
Totally a pleasure.